Hey, welcome to HouseGroups. I'm Michelle Eblen, and we're back again for our second week in the series Many Gifts, One Spirit. And just a little review for us. Last week, we talked about the 3 reasons why spiritual gifts are important. So let's review those. The first reason is spiritual gifts are used to strengthen the faith of others. And then the second reason was spiritual gifts exercise our own faith. And then when we do those 2 things, the third reason why spiritual gifts are so important is they give glory to God. So we know why spiritual gifts are important. And last week you had a little bit of time in your small groups to talk about what your spiritual gifts are. But I want to dive deeper into that to help us really answer the question, how can I figure out what my spiritual gifts are? And to figure that out, I want to give you guys 4 practices to embrace that will really help you discover what your spiritual gifts are. So we're going to jump right in to the first practice. And the first practice is this: be with God. Okay, so when I say be with God, there are just a few ways that I'll give you as examples for how you can do that. So example 1 is spending time in the book of Proverbs. There's 31 chapters in the book of Proverbs, and just read 1 a day and ask God, what's 1 verse that stands out to me here? That's a great way to be with God. Another is worship. When you're driving to school, play worship music. And then another way that I really like to practice being with God is I pick a verse for the week that I meditate on each day. I just read it in the morning every day. And all of those are examples of how you can be with God, how you can get to know Jesus's character. And the reason why this is so important is because when you get to know Jesus, you get to know his love for you. And Paul, the guy we talked about last week, he's written lots of the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians 13, right after he gets done talking about spiritual gifts, he talks about love. And in 1 Corinthians 13:2, this is what he says. He says, if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. So Paul's saying you can have all these abilities, you can have these great spiritual gifts, but if you don't have love, it's not effective. So what that means for us is if love does not compel us, self-interest will, which is why being with God is so important. It's the first practice to embrace as we figure out how do we know what our spiritual gifts are. So as we spend time with God, that brings us into the second practice. The second practice is this: it's see the need. So consider your little Iowa. These can be your classmates, it could be your coworkers. If you do sports, it could be your teammates. And ask God this question: God, whose faith can I strengthen here? And just be attentive to who comes to mind, because that's probably who God's saying, hey, something's going on in their lives. I want you to be direct with them and care for them. So that's the second practice. See the need. And that brings us into the third practice, which is where a little bit more courage comes in. The third practice is ask the question. And the question I'm talking about is this: God, how can I strengthen their faith? God's brought a person to mind, and then he wants you to ask him how to strengthen their faith. And then in the same way, just be attentive to the ideas that come to mind. For me, it's inviting them to coffee, or if they don't like coffee, it's a smoothie. And that's a space where I get to hear them and I get to care for them and encourage them. So, and sometimes if you have a quiet time, that's a great time to say, God, okay, whose name came to mind and how can I encourage them? And God will bring ideas to mind. If your gift isn't encouraging, he might say, hey, lend a helping hand in some way. Whatever it is, it's obedience. So that brings us into our fourth practice, which is responding with action. God can give you all the ideas on how to care for people, but if you don't respond, it doesn't do anything. So this is where obedience comes into play, and this is where you're gonna have to exercise your faith. So as you engage in these practices, remember, responding with action is where God's gonna take you out of your comfort zone. It's gonna be the area where growth happens because you are exercising that faith muscle and saying yes to God over and over. And take comfort in this. God's not asking you to be perfect in your obedience. He's asking you to be faithful. That's it. And as you're faithful in obeying, God will stretch you and it will encourage other people. So these are the 4 practices, and my encouragement to you is to engage in these 4 practices and repeat, because you're gonna have some ideas that come to mind and they're gonna be great. They're gonna actually strengthen people's faith, and then you're gonna have some ideas that come to mind, you're gonna obey, and they're just maybe not gonna go as well. And that's gonna be God's way of teaching you, oh, okay, that might not be your spiritual gift, move on, try again. As you pursue obedience in the ideas that God's bringing to mind, this is what I want to challenge you to do. Consider, discern, was what I just did effective in strengthening someone else's faith? And if so, that might be God's way of enlightening you into knowing what your spiritual gifts are. And if it's not, that's okay. You're not supposed to be gifted in every way, just a few. But just imagine if all of us decided to embrace these practices. When I first learned about these concepts, I learned them from John Piper, one of his sermons, and it truly changed me. So the week after I had heard this sermon, I was at Levi, my husband's church. I had never been there before. It was in Indianola, a different town. And at the end of the sermon, the pastor gave us 3 minutes to be with God in silence. And in those 3 minutes, the question of whose faith can I strengthen came to mind. And then there was this lady sitting in front of me, and she was highlighted to me. And I was like, no, dang it. God's about to ask me to do something. So I was like, okay, God, how do you want me to encourage her? How do you want me to strengthen her faith? And he said, pray for her. That's the idea that came to mind. So I was like, okay. And I felt really nervous because this was a stranger, and I was with Levi and 3 of his football friends that I didn't know. So if I was gonna, at the end of the service, pray for her, I was gonna have to keep these 3 people waiting, and I didn't want to do that. And so I was wrestling with God a little bit. And then this is what came to mind. I felt like God was saying to me, Michelle, will it strengthen her faith? And I was like, yes, Lord. And then he was like, Michelle, will it exercise your faith? And I was like, yes. And then he was like, Michelle, will it give glory to me? And I was like, yes, it will. And so I was so nervous, but I wanted to respond with action. I wanted to obey. And so the 3 minutes were over, and I obeyed, and I was so nervous. So she was standing in front of me, and I didn't introduce myself. I just kind of went up to her, and I was like, I feel like I need to pray for you. And immediately her response, there was this relief that came over her, and she started crying. And I was like, wow, okay, well, now let me introduce my name. I'm Michelle. And then she told me, I was just walking past this church. I just lost my son, and I felt like God was saying, go in. And so I did. And during the sermon, I felt like I needed to recommit my life to Christ, but I was afraid to tell anybody. So yes, can you pray for me? And so I prayed for her, and then I ended up connecting her to a pastor. And this was a week after learning all of this. And so through this experience, God really encouraged me. He was basically saying to me, Michelle, when you obey, when you are willing to use your spiritual gifts, I'm ready to give you opportunities to care for my people and exercise your own faith. And so that is my encouragement to you, is as you end this series, ask that question to God daily. God, how can I strengthen the faith of those around me? God, whose faith can I strengthen? And you will be amazed at who God brings into your life. And just imagine if all of us did that, we could look back at our days and say, wow, today I saw God speak to me, and I saw him use me, and I saw others be strengthened by what God's up to in my life. How amazing would that be? So I challenge you to embrace that question and hold your small group members accountable to it. Next week, when you guys get back, ask, whose faith did you strengthen? Or how did you try? Because I tell you that story because that was the story of a lot of encouragement, but I've had a few ones that did not go that well. And that's okay. You share them and you laugh together and it's good. So my encouragement to you as we end this study, embrace these 4 practices and begin the habit of waking up every day and saying, God, whose faith can I strengthen today? Let's do this together and let's hold one another accountable. Enjoy your small group, guys.